Hello. On this channel, we often talk about how mental health terms from scientific literature become popularized as part of our social life, and the kind of pros and cons of that phenomenon. The term dissociation is a shining example of this. You hear it everywhere. And the thing is, it's also an example of just how complicated and fascinating mental health terms and phenomena are. Of course, everything is more complicated the more you think about it. I should know. But dissociation is a particular example of something that can't be broken down into a dichotomy the way a lot of other mental health terms perhaps are able to do. Normally, it'd be easier to say this is a condition and this is not, and from there be able to assess whether somebody is correctly using the term or correctly perhaps self-diagnosing with something or perhaps is off base. Dissociation is not like that. Let me explain to you why. One of the first types of discourse that you see about dissociation online is certain people saying that dissociation is not something everyone experiences. It's not the same as zoning out. The thing is, the scientific community generally disagrees with that. According to the DSM-5, dissociation can be defined as disruption of and/or discontinuity in the normal integration of consciousness, memory, identity, emotion, perception, body representation, motor control, and behavior. According to the American Psychiatric Association, mild experience of dissociation is a normal process that everyone has experienced. Mild. This can be understood by thinking of dissociation as a spectrum, which can cover a range from relatively common experiences, such as being absorbed completely by a book or movie, to severe states, such as not recognizing oneself in the mirror. In that way, dissociation can kind of be seen as a comparable idea to that of anxiety or depression, in that everybody may experience it to something of a mild extent at different periods of time, for short periods of time often. But as it becomes more intense and contains different symptoms and can impair your life functions, it can then be potentially looked at as a condition, a disorder that a person might have. Speaking of conditions, there are 5 dissociative disorders according to the DSM-5, those being dissociative identity disorder, DID, dissociative amnesia, DA, depersonalization and derealization disorder, DPDRD, other specified dissociative disorders, OSDD, and unspecified dissociative disorder, UDD. Among these, DID, which used to be known as multiple personality disorder, unfortunately, is probably the one that's most commonly discussed, but there are actually 3 main dissociative disorders, those being the first 3, DID, DA, and DPDRD. A video by Osmosis from Elsevier goes into more depth on explaining each of the 3, but to put it shortly using explanations from the APA, dissociative identity disorder can be characterized by the feeling of having multiple identities, more on this later, gaps in memory, and significant distress in daily life. Dissociative amnesia can be characterized as not being able to recall information about oneself, not normal forgetting. This amnesia is usually related to a traumatic or stressful event. And depersonalization derealization disorder is characterized by experience either of or both depersonalization or experiences of unreality and detachment from one's mind, self, or body, and derealization, which is experiences of unreality or detachment from one's surroundings. Now, it's here where I'm going to say if you're concerned that you have one of these disorders and are experiencing a lot of distress mentally, reading and watching informative content online can be helpful. But of course, the best, most surefire way to assess yourself is to go see an expert, a trained clinician, a trained mental health professional. And I am not one of those. Just to be clear. It's also worth noting that dissociation experiences can come as a result of other conditions. In particular, PTSD and acute stress disorder are examples of conditions which often have dissociative symptoms. And this works with the clinical understanding of where dissociation comes from, that being generally trauma and stress to overwhelming degrees. And this in itself is its own complicated conversation. So we'll talk about that after the break. Firstly, the trauma model posits that dissociation is a psychobiological state or trait that functions as a protective response to traumatic or overwhelming experiences. There are different versions and interpretations of the trauma model, but essentially they always come down to the idea that dissociation is caused by an overwhelm of trauma or stress in the brain, as a way to process and operate as a sort of defense mechanism against those things. This makes a lot of sense, and for a lot of you who may be experiencing sometimes bouts of dissociation, it might make sense to you too. My experiences with dissociation, I will have these moments in time, sometimes hours, at times it was even days, where I would be feeling completely out of body almost, feeling like I had control over myself in a way that was disconcerting because I didn't feel like I was in myself. I didn't feel like I had any real type of control over the situation. It felt like I was monitoring a third person, monitoring a body, and monitoring a sort of situation that was stressful, but I didn't necessarily even feel the stress anymore, or I did, but it was a really complicated thing essentially. When I analyze these situations, I generally would always connect it to periods of time where I felt a lot of frustration and overwhelm with stressful situations in my life, with anxiety, with situations that maybe I felt like I was revisiting some dark feelings in myself and felt almost as if things were helpless to a degree. And I just kind of didn't feel like I was even able to sort of fully be in myself because, I don't know, there was just like a lack of connection there at a certain point. Like my brain was just like, nah. Basically, it was just like my brain was like, nah. Now, of course, with disorders, people have so much more severe situations. And again, if we talk about it as a spectrum, we can understand how these different things lead to different types of symptoms, different types of reactions, and take different types of forms. With that said, there are skeptics of the trauma model, which the article we've been citing from Dialogues in Clinical Neuroscience talks about at a certain point, laying out a particular opposite to the trauma model, which is essentially highly skeptical of the reality of dissociative disorders in general. Without getting too deep into it, this point of view has apparently some connections to certain advocacy groups and potentially has some similarities to previous discussions we've had about people who are very skeptical of the mental health system in general and its diagnoses. And in this case, it posits that DID, for instance, is an unscientific fad, quote unquote, and that dissociative disorders are conditions that are kind of imposed into people that are highly manipulable. Suffice it to say, the article is highly critical of this point of view, and I see why. The trauma model makes a lot of sense for a lot of people and can be a really useful model through which those with dissociative experiences can resolve their struggles. And in general, it's not super fun to dismiss disorders that lots of people experience in lots of different ways as essentially being made up. Neither the scientific record nor the vibes support this. With that said, anytime we get into these conversations about the nature of mental conditions and the mental health system, we are forced to confront the reality that this system does not work for everybody and has some reasons to be critical and skeptical of it. In fact, it's something that's constructed within a social order, and thus it is something that has to be viewed critically if we're going to be critical of that social order. Now, for this video, I'm going to go in a direction that you may not expect at all in order to address this. We'll talk about that after the break. So when this topic was voted on by my audience in a poll, a community post, there was a particular comment that caught my eye. A user wrote, "If you do mention DID, please mention the Plural SelfAdvocacy movement for reforming the treatment of systems. Treating us all as mentally ill for being plural has caused so many of us harm. Not all systems dissociate." So out of this intrigue, I began doing a little bit of research about what they mean by plural, what plurality is, and what this is all about. Now, I don't know much, and I certainly haven't made myself an expert. I still am a bit confused about what is meant by the term system here, but I do think I have something of a handle that can be useful to describe here. Plurality or multiplicity refers to the psychological phenomenon in which a body experiences multiple consciousnesses, or essentially multiple selves within it. These different consciousnesses are sometimes referred to as headmates or alters, a being or a body that contains multiple consciousnesses, and so essentially is multiple people, is sometimes called a plurin, instead of a person. So as you can imagine, this type of experience and identity raises a lot of questions and conflicts about the way we view the world philosophically, spiritually, health-wise, security-wise, a lot of things. I'm not going to come close to addressing all of that. And I definitely do not want to get involved and embroiled in discourse with alter-human communities, talking about communities that I'm not a part of, that I have very little understanding of. I want to be able to mind my own business here and be respectful rather than start speaking out of turn. But for this particular video and this topic, what I think this user was getting at and how this situates itself in what we're talking about is how this phenomenon situates itself in our mental health system and our understanding of mental health in general, which is to say, wow, it's very complicated and wow, it's very tough. An article detailing the history of plural self-advocacy shows that plural people have attempted to speak for themselves for a very long time, often against the stigma of something being inherently wrong with them mentally. For example, a book from 1993, written by multiple mental health professionals about what we now know as dissociative identity disorder, but at the time was called multiple personality disorder. I think you see where I'm going with this, posits that some perceive the alters as real people. It was only until recently when the medical community started slightly opening some doors here and there towards accepting the validity of plural people. And of course, this has been accompanied by the rise of social media, in which folks have been able to represent themselves across a ton of different communities and find community with others who share those identities. Of note was the rise of Plural Gang, which is a hashtag that emerged during H-Bomber-Guy's famous Donkey Kong 64 fundraising live stream, in which a plurin came out on stream as being plural, and afterwards a bunch of people across social media started using that hashtag to also chime in and represent that community.
We are a plural trans speedrunner. We used to work for Games Done Quick and do a bunch of other speedrunning events and stuff. But we're here now.
I mentioned you.
Oh, what? You're the famous.
No,
what?
Everyone's famous.
Actually,
now.
I see some plural gang in the chat. Can we get some more plural gang in the chat, please?
Now, one of the biggest moments cited as a change in the mental health system's acceptance or acknowledgement towards plural people was in the DSM-5 and its changing of some wording, some verbiage about dissociative identity disorder to clearly state that the definition of the disorder has to necessitatively include distress and impairment. This is a big deal because what it's saying is not that the experience of having multiple selves is in and of itself a disorder, but rather whether or not it is distressful for you and impairing for you to feel like you are in and out of a self is a sign of the dissociation, is a sign of the potential dissociative disorder. And I think when you talk about that distinction, this is actually crucial to understanding how the mental health care system, as it shapes and evolves, can accommodate us and how we can use it across different ways of understanding how our brains work. I'll get into that after the break. Thanks for watching the ad breaks. It helps the channel a lot. So there's this thing we do where we relate to each other as humans. I know it's kind of weird. It's not going to happen anymore with the way that the internet is going, so don't worry about it. And sometimes we have to make a ton of assumptions without realizing that we've made those assumptions in order to try to relate to one another. The dissociation discourse illustrates that. A lot of people who share their struggle with dissociation, their extremely valid struggle with dissociation, will do so, very understandably, by talking about how they feel like they're outside of themselves in the way that I just did, which is to say, not necessarily by saying I'm going through a lot of pain outright, but by sharing an experience which we expect the other person will say, oh, wow, that sounds horrible, because we have a certain trying to relate to one another thing. This is a subtle linguistic phenomenon that often isn't problematic at all. Like, one instance in which we do it is when we say, oh, I don't have anything to eat. We recognize that usually people will understand, because everybody generally eats, that you need something to eat. You're upset about not having something to eat. This is something that should change. This is a bad condition. And even if a person eats less than us, they'll sort of understand where we're coming from, of course. But if I tell you that I'm, for instance, struggling mentally, and I do so by saying, I don't feel like myself, we may not realize that there's a bit of a potential disconnect with some people. Not necessarily that we've done something wrong at all, but by the idea that some people may hear that and say, wow, that sounds horrible. But some people might hear that and say, oh, I do that all the time, actually. It's great. Because the distinction is the distress. Some people may experience things that are akin to dissociation, but if they don't have any distress, we can't really say that they're dissociating. They're probably just fine, and they just have a different brain. They have a different set of consciousnesses or consciousness.
You know, some systems, they see themselves as, we're here to serve an original person. Once we're no longer needed, we'll fade into the night, and that's fine. And that's integration. And for a long time, people in my field saw that as the goal.
That's always the goal, right?
That's always the goal, is to get them back to normal, where it's just one. But the more we study and the more we listen to the experiences of people who live with this, for a lot of them, integration isn't the goal. The goal is living in harmony. The goal is being aware of one another so we don't wake up with lost time and saying, what happened?
Yeah, that's probably not ideal.
Obviously, the wrong thing to pull from that would be to say dissociation is definitely good. The key distinction that DSM-5 makes, again, is that dissociative disorders come with distress and impairment. So, if you experience multiple selves, if you experience a being outside of the self, but it doesn't bring you any distress or impairment really, then actually, you're not dissociating at all. You may be a plurine, or you may just be a person whose brain does that, and you're cool with it, it works for you, and that's great. And if you're fine, if you're happy, if you're healthy, if you're getting on well, it's not okay for other people to come in and say, that's crazy, that's wrong. There's something wrong with you mentally, because you just have a different thing going on. And I say this with some level of connection because to a degree, I relate to that. I used to get that feeling of dissociation a lot more, and I don't really anymore. Let me not jinx it, because I don't really feel distress anymore when I'm outside of myself. I actually just don't feel a strong connection to the idea of a self at all. That's like my thing. It's a thing we'd have to talk about in another video. But in short, I just kind of feel like the self is a construct, and it's something that I think exists in a specific way and perform in a certain way and inhibit. But ultimately, I'm also constantly feeling like, you know what? There's a self that I'm outside of and I'm kind of controlling, rather than feeling super attached to it as if it's a fundamental part of my existence. Again, super out there. This is a conversation about something else for another day. But the point is that the mental health system is constructed. It's a system through which we understand what's going on in our brains with the data and the accounts we have available. And then we come up with solutions to treat these conditions or experiences that is compatible with our social and economic systems. And that's a big part of why the mental health system often fails people. It is a human-made construct that has to work within other human-made constructs, all of which have huge flaws, particularly with exploitation and marginalization of people. And I'm saying all of this not to demean the positive abilities of the mental health system. Again, I highly recommend, if you are having distress, if you are having concerns about your mental condition, that you should go out and seek medical professional treatment. Just know that if one thing doesn't work for you, there's always something else you can consider. You and your brain are never absolutely screwed. Every moment contains the potential for you to make a breakthrough, for you to find inner peace, for you to make sense of the things going on in your brain. And learning about how other people go through their own processes and figure out their own brains is a huge, huge help. So connect with one another. Thank you. That's the end of the video, I guess. If you like this video, hit the like button, leave a comment with your thoughts, and subscribe if you'd like to watch more. Hit the notification bell, because sometimes I go live, sometimes I do random stuff. And also, if you want to send me $1 to buy a bag of chips, you can send me $1 to my Ko-Fi. I would really appreciate that. Thank you. I hope you're having a good day. And if not, it happens, right? It happens. See you. Goodbye.